the Puranas. Something here. Okay, so after we see that, this is not a really chronological understanding as such, but some sort of an idea that is given. So with that, we have Ganga is personified as a goddess, okay? But she's not an ordinary, she's not an official goddess. She's not like Lakshmi or like Padmavati even, or even does not have an independent official temple. She first emanates, comes out, she is personified as a goddess on the crocodile, standing on the crocodile, but the form is taken from Yakshi, who is bringing food to the Buddha. Okay, so iconographically, there are certain problems and certain questions that is raised as to why does this goddess have this iconography. Okay. But soon literature takes it over, and as we know, Kalidasa or Bilhana or Bhartrihari, they praise the river Ganges so much. And all rivers are said to be goddesses then. Okay? But with this substantiation in sculpture that we see comes, of course, at the same time, you have a ritual which continues the sacredness for a long time. And with that, with political aspect being integrated, you have the Gupta kings, as well as the Chola kings calling themselves as Gangaikonda Cholapuram. To get the Ganges water, which is so sacred and fertile, gives a status to the kings as well. Then, of course, she's personified with, but the question is, why? It's very easy to understand her as a giver of life and wealth and prosperity. But why is she associated with death is the question. Is it because the Ganges waters are dangerous and children drowned there, people drowned there? Or is it because she's associated with Shiva, who carries it on his head, releases the water as the god because he's the god of death? And how to associate the Ganges with Shiva, right? That's another big aspect, which I did not go into detail. But then there is also the other aspect of historical events where people with incurable diseases went and drowned themselves in the Ganga. King Vikramaditya, the Chalukyan king, the Someshwara, he also drowned himself. So here it has to do with death and how they will attain to heaven. So then the other aspect is ashes are immersed in the rivers. They're immersed in all rivers, as part of Hinduism. But why Ganges waters are so sacred is the question. Is it because Ganges was the earliest river that became sacred? Was it Narmada that became sacred at the same time? Of course, so all these questions, some of the questions are not answered, but this is an article that this is the type of social art historian that I am, that I like to do, where I incorporate history and literature and traditions. And of course, we have one of the most important literature where the dichotomy between life and death is shown in Bhartrihari's Vairagya Shataka, where he says it is desire and passion and all sorts of different words that he uses. It is dangerous, it is death, right? So this dichotomy has always been there. At the same time, we have the last poet, Jagannath, who goes there in 17th century, and because he's excommunicated, because he loved a Muslim woman, and he sits on the river Ganges steps and composes the poem of 52 verses, dedicating one step for one verse, right? So here is a very long history where one can write a book, but my aim was just to show its multiple identity and the historical evolution. Although it is very difficult to understand the chronology of what things happened in terms of ritual, and when did that concept of immersion of ashes came about. And with this, I think I have exceeded my time or not, I'm not sure, but but if there is anything, if you want me to talk about anything else or
okay, I think what we'll do is we'll keep moving. and then we're all available for questions and answers as we move along.
Okay.
And I really appreciate, Nalini, how you highlighted the accessibility issue, as well as the relative paucity of resources from early times and more medieval times. What your article does is allow your fine photography to be downloaded anywhere in the world. And I appreciate that. I really salute that aspect that you have brought to us. So thank you. And now we're going to turn to another art historian, Deepak Shimkada of Chaffey College, who spoke earlier today about Goddess and will share with us an overview of his work on Touche Hittite.
Can you increase the volume at all? Is there a way to?
Can you make it louder, Lane?
I'd say a fair amount, if that's okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful. What a lovely evening to gather on campus. I wish I could be there, but anyway, this will do. At least I feel like I'm with you guys there. All right, now very briefly, this is a monument. This is a controversial piece. Some people call it royal bath. Some people call it not even a bath. It is simply for decoration. Some people call it, this is a design to offer water to gods, not for bathing. So there are a lot of these issues going on, especially.
Okay, explain to us, Deepak, where we are. We're in Nepal, correct?
Yeah, we are in Nepal in the Kathmandu Valley, and this particular the bath, royal bath, is located in the city of Lalitpur, the beautiful city, or Patan, the next city, Patan, and this is called Patan Darbar Square. And if you go back to the slide, you know, the big, the palace to your right is the palace that was built by King Siddhi Narasimha Malla in 1747. And then along with that, in the middle of the courtyard, he has two large courtyards. If you look to the building to your right, there are two what you call courtyards. And then in one of the courtyards, these are all his residential palace. And he has built in a step down what we call bath. Again, and then water runs throughout. And it is pretty much like the Roman aqueduct. You know, the water has been running, you know, for forever, and we do not know the exact source of where the water is coming, but then the water, you know, flows all the time. So I'm going to tackle with the 6 areas that I want to tackle. Number one is the meaning of the name Tusa. You know, some call it Tusha, which is actually a Newari name, Nepal Bhasha name. Some people call it Thusa. There's slightly difference, Tusa or Thusa. The meaning changes when you say Thusa. Thusa means the head of a cow, and Tusa means it probably has no any meaning. My own feeling is that perhaps this is a corrupt version of Tusa. But anyway, I mean, the article deals with that controversy and with that some kind of a happy resolution. I hope you will read the article. So anyway, so that is number one is the name. I have gone through defining what it is exactly. And there are also a lot of other Hitis. Hiti is a Newari word for water spout, where the water flows from. It's a conduit. The water flows from that tap. That is called Hiti. That's a Newari word. But in Nepali, it is called Dhara, D-H-A-R-A. All right. And I have also given there are various types of Hitis in the Kathmandu Valley. There are 3 main cities. Each one has, typical type of Dhara and built by many people. and they are being used for not only for bathing, for drinking, also for washing their clothes, utensils and things like that. It is a multi-purpose place where people gather for a social gathering, for fetching water and washing themselves and doing all kinds of things, laundry and whatnot. And then this the Tusahiti is obviously built by the king for the king purpose. No one is supposed to go inside. It is his ritual bath that he takes in there every morning. And also it is built according to specific tantric methodology, tantric principle, because it is a pit designed in such a way that it has a shape of a yoni. This is what I'm arguing. Whether people buy it or do not buy it, that's of course your prerogative. But I'm arguing that the pit itself, is in the shape of a yoni. All right, and then also the water that flows from the tap, which is the spout, is also has a shape of a yoni, rather than the shape of a cow's head. Even though there are several dharas, if you go through the slides, you will see there are many dharas that are shaped with calf, the cow's head. And again, my question is, if it is indeed based on the cow's head, if Tusa is the name of the cow, then why not all those dharas, all those water spouts that have the actual shape of a cow, not called Tusa? They have a different names, but then they are never called Tusa. So that's also my question. Why not are they called Tusa? Okay, so these are all interesting points. And then I have also discussed the iconography of the Dhara, and also there's also notion of purity and impurity, and so on and so forth. And also, obviously, this being a very opulent bathing place for a king, it has become quite popular. This is, visited by thousands and thousands of tourists. And not only that, it has also become popular among the tourists and then also among filmmakers. And there was a film shot in that courtyard, Arabian Nights, of all the movies, Arabian Nights was shot in there. So I have a little, what you call a link for that movie that was shot in 1974. So I don't know whether my time is up. So of course we can ask questions later on.
How many minutes is the clip?
I'm sorry?
Do you have the clip? Do you want to do share screen and take the clip so we can see it?
You mean the movie?
The movie? Yeah.
No, it is on YouTube, but I wish I would have, done that, but I've given a clip in my.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you find it, let us know. If we have time at the end, we'll look at it at the end.
All right. Okay, we'll do.
Okay. Great. Okay, well, thank you. And again, this illustrates what we're able to do with this journal and having these fine color plates, the presenters themselves, the photographers, and the concept of this particular step well. I remember the first time I went to a step well in India, my head exploded. It was just so interesting.
Right. If I might point out, again, and I have hesitated to compare it with the steps well of Gujarat and Rajasthan, because for obvious reason, because the steps well of India are primarily for drawing water from the deep, wherever there is a water scarcity. Then you dig down, and then of course you bring water home for drinking purpose. And then people do not wash things, do not do their laundries, do not obviously dip in the water there. It's basically for drinking purpose. But now in Kathmandu, it has a multiple purpose. It's not only for drinking water, but doing other things as well. And also, this is also a little bit of collaborative effort on my part. I have a research associate in Kathmandu who has compiled a lot of this information about various types of Hitis in the three major cities of Kathmandu. And, the history of this Hiti goes back to 5th century, Lichhabi period in Nepal, in the valley. So we still have Hiti built in 5th century. But today, there are 118 stone spouts in Kathmandu, 103 in Bhaktapur, and 48 in Patan. So altogether, there are at least a couple of hundred running Hitis, and they all run, water run. Whenever the water source stops, then of course people they resort to the stone Hitis for drinking and for doing things. So that's a basically brief history of this place.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Now to come up and share a summary of his work in 7 minutes. But please, David, come sit with us. The title of David's article is Digital and Spatial Humanities, Mapping Eurasia-Pacific Early Trade and Belief Linkages. And the primary author is in Moscow. His name is Igor Sitnikov, and David is thankfully here to share what he has done with his collaborator.
And thank you for that. And Igor is with us. I believe he can join us in terms of that presentation.
Igor, can you hear us? Can you unmute and say hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Very
do you hear
good.
me?
We see you now. Excellent.
So Igor, would you like to say a few words about how we got this idea about Eurasia Pacific as a region?
I think everyone can read it in the article, and probably it's better just introduce myself if you're interested in. Would you like to make a short introducing?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, good evening, dear colleagues, or maybe for someone is afternoon. Here in, I'm not really in Moscow. I live close to Moscow, 125 miles from Moscow, in the city which calls Ryazan. And now he is 4 o'clock in the morning. So I should wake up for this meeting very early. It is an honor to me to participate in this conference, of course. I am a PhD candidate at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan, Taipei, and a citizen of Russian Federation. And here, okay, I said that already. My main profession is fine arts, painting, graphics, book design, and illustration. I continue to work in this field and additionally recently teach fine arts professional disciplines in the College of Fine Arts in my home city. I teach the painting, drawing, and the figurative art composition. 12 years I lived in Taiwan, where I studied Chinese, then graduated from International Master Program of Taiwan Studies, and finally had taken the full course at International Doctoral Program of Asia Pacific Studies. During my studies, I focused on cultural anthropology in the field of prehistory and comparative mythology. My studies interests spread all over Eurasia, from the Western Europe through Siberia and South Asia to the East and Southeast Asia, up to New Guinea and Oceania. During all my studies in the National Chengchi University in Taiwan, Dr. David Blundell was my supervisor professor. Nevertheless, in 2015, I returned back to Russia. With Dr. Blundell, till now, we continue to cooperate, and now here at the 15th Annual Conference of South Asian Studies Association is our fourth experience of scholarly cooperation. Twice we represented our co-authored works in Budapest, Hungary, and last year here in Los Angeles at the Conference of South Asian Studies Association. I'm very grateful to you, Professor Blundell. Professor Blundell, probably you would like to continue to introduce our paper. And if we will have time later, I could talk about my long-time interest to Indian civilization, history, culture, and religion.
Yeah, thank you, Igor. So this is an article about the Asia region through the Pacific. So we mapped trend findings in anthropology and archaeology, and even more specific subfields as folklore, integrated into important contributions to the understanding of periodic environmental changes, and introduced technical innovations, reports of how transformation happened in terms of social structures that determine mechanisms and levels of cross-cultural trade activity across the region. We have traced the early trade and belief linkages across Eurasia Pacific in terms of the approach that we use, digital humanities from the Neolithic to early history. Antecedents leading up to the outcome of what we know today as the Silk Road, produced as an outcome of this study as a dynamic time map. And recently, this has been demonstrated at the Spatial Humanities Mapping Project in terms of the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism, displayed as a 3D virtual exhibition in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And this has produced an exhibition that has integrated narratives for the public to explore how Buddhism traveled through maritime routes out of South Asia into the Indo-Pacific region as far as Korea. And we are using this platform in terms of digital and spatial humanities to give the readers and the public an understanding of how these networks were integrated from Neolithic into early history.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And I wanted to make sure that our viewers here saw some of the monoliths and some of the other factors.
So the one on top there you can see is a monolith from Ireland, and the one at the bottom is a monolith from Taiwan. So these monoliths have spread through at least 3,500 years ago, through the Neolithic and into South Asia spread. And there's an interesting item when you look at the megalithic sites in South India, especially, they all became essentially in early history Buddhist sites.
Yes. Okay, we're going to continue now with the fourth article in this first issue of the first volume of Monsoon. And Debashish Banerji, I don't believe you have any pictures in this.
No, no. Well, I mean, Chris asked the board members to contribute on articles, and since so many of them are art historians, including me, I decided art history isn't the best thing to feature here. So I put on my other hat,
Yes.
which is that of a scholar of Indian philosophy and of Sri Aurobindo studies. And so this article is called
Vedantic Basis and Praxis of the Integral Advaita of Sri Aurobindo.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So what this leads to, or what this leads from, is I'm going to read. Sri Aurobindo dates 1872 to 1950, was a modern yogi and philosopher who founded a path of yoga which he named integral yoga. The term integral in integral yoga responds to a peculiarly modern problem. The fact that we are exposed to world traditions of spirituality which have different goals, practices, and experiences. This has exacerbated the competition of religions and spiritualities and led to religious violence on the one hand, and the need for interreligious dialogue and interspirituality on the other. In the first half of the 20th century, the more popular response to this problem was perennialism, whose most flattering description, common in the New Age, is all spiritual teachings are saying the same thing. Over time, this was critiqued and nuanced, leading to the other pole of pluralism, according to which not only Ramakrishna's, quote, there are as many paths as there are opinions, joto pot, toto pot, but, quote, there are as many goals and as many experiences of truth as there are opinions, is the more apt description. In fact, we may contrast this to the more common images employed to describe perennialism. For example, Vivekananda's metaphor of the many rivers merging in the one ocean, given during his first speech at the Parliament of World Religions, or the similar image of the many paths meeting at the mountain top. In both these examples, the rivers or the paths in question are erased in their destination. Jorge Ferrer, earlier from CIIS, has given another kind of image, the image of the many shores that mariners traveling from an ocean may alight on. Sri Aurobindo's integral, the term, acknowledges this kind of spiritual pluralism, but looks for a paradoxical plane of experience in which the many and the one may coexist without erasing each other. This is mentally not it's a paradox. To arrive at a path which may lead to this goal, he proposes a synthesis of a variety of approaches and an opening and surrender to a higher power, or Shakti, which may carry us to this point of integration. The parts he synthesizes includes the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Shakta Tantra, and Vaishnavism. Characteristically, his yoga can be described in terms of each of these parts, characteristically, because if it is a plural and one at the same time, as an integral form of that path. Following this approach, Haridas Chaudhary has named Sri Aurobindo's yoga in terms of Vedanta as integral Vedanta, or in Sanskrit, Purnadvaita Vedanta. In this article, I have tried to derive a Vedantic praxis for this approach based on what are called Mahavakyas. Mahavakyas are pithy statements used in the Upanishads to focus contemplation of the realization of the chosen path. Sri Aurobindo has also encouraged different formulations of his yoga based on contemporary and contextual needs. Keeping these in mind, I have argued for a Vedantic praxis for the integral yoga based on the 4 Mahavakyas: Om Tat Sat, Sarvam Khaluvidam Brahma, Tat Tvam Asi, and Aham Brahmasmi. Here, Om Tat Sat focuses contemplation on the transcendent. Sarvam Khaluvidam Brahma turns it on the word as a whole and invites us to keep its oneness in our consciousness. This may be thought of as a praxis for sustainability, what the Bhagavad Gita refers to as Loka Samgraha, the keeping together of the world. Tattvamasi further specifies this generic identity in terms of a world of plural individuations. And finally, Aham Brahmasmi equates all these to the deepest truth of oneself. The question of the integral here becomes how to practice and integrate these realizations into one so that they coexist and don't erase each other. To know that, I invite you to read the article.
And it's quite lovely that my own article, which I'll briefly summarize, mashes up a whole bunch of different things through the perspective of a thinker called Haribhadra. And just as Jorge Ferrer said, oh, but they land on different shores, Haribhadra Yakiniputra in the 8th century said the wrong metaphor, that whole thing about the ocean. He said that every lake is distinct from every other lake. As I was translating that shloka years ago and puzzling, I had the good fortune of traveling to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which meant that I had to fly over Minnesota. And I looked down, and what is the tagline for Minnesota? Land of 10,000 lakes. And when I saw each of those lakes, I said, aha! He is disallowing, again, the paradox. He's disallowing the erasure of difference, but carrying the commonality of we're all water. So this is a particular mindset that has various names within Indian thought. And I stuck with Haribhadra. That project was more than 30 years ago. And I got the Fulbright Nehru Fellowship to finish a different Haribhadra text called the Yoga Bindu. And this will be a very early piece of a larger book that will emerge. But in this book called the Yoga Bindu, he says in the beginning that yoga requires the shedding off, but he doesn't call it karma, the shedding off of that feeling of other. It says regardless if you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jain, and he, says Shaivite and sort of Vaishnavite, says regardless, we need to work at purifying that icky feeling. Then he goes on in this text, and what I highlight here are 3 practices. 1, the practice of yoga, as I defined it, as he defines it. 2, the practice of puja. And earlier today, we had a lovely conversation with Venu about Ishtadevata. And what he says that, well, regardless, he doesn't even say regardless of the deity. He says, look at what we do in puja. We offer our thoughts, we offer songs, we offer beautiful garments, regardless of faith. And then the third commonality is japa. There's a beautiful description of how we achieve that state of equipoise through reciting, through prayer, through mantra. And again, he does not specify to whom that mantra is directed. Now, while we were living in India on the Fulbright, my wife and I, who's hiding from me, we were in, for the first time, the high holy days of the autumn. We experienced Ganesh Puja while we were in Mumbai and Maharashtra in August. We experienced Navratri while we were in Delhi and elsewhere. It's 9 days, so celebration of the goddess and all different really fantastic celebrations. We were in Delhi during Paryushan, which is the great celebration you can see here of Jain Puja and an extended period of fasting. And we were also in Delhi and traveling. Actually, we were in Delhi during Diwali when everybody goes home. And it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, if you're Christian, if you're Vaishnava, if you're Shaiva, if you're, everybody has a reason to celebrate light. And it's roughly a little bit before our own Thanksgiving. So you just feel that family coming togetherness. Now, while we were there, I'm an avid reader of the newspaper, and I became a great fan of The Hindu, which was co-founded by Mahatma Gandhi, edited by his own son for 30 years, and our landing in India corresponded with the 150th birth centenary of Mahatma Gandhi. Navin Doshi, who is here with us, walked with Gandhi, and we heard other tales of Gandhi, actually from Ramila Thapar last night. And it was so great to see the newspaper filled with this honoring of the icon of nonviolence. Yet, there were also other disturbing things of political nature, namely the exclusion of Muslims trying to seek refuge in India. And as I puzzled why that bothered me, I remembered Dalrymple's book, 9 Lives. And in this powerful collection of short stories based on his own experiences in South Asia, he tells about the persecution of the Sufis by the Wahhabis in Pakistan. And I thought, boy, it'd be sure nice if some of these folks, the Ahmadiyyas who were deemed heretical, Sufis who were deemed heretical, being persecuted and killed in other places in South Asia, if India, long a safe haven for Sufis, would be okay with some of these people going through like what we do with refugees. We just screen them and screen them and screen them. So that was Gandhi on one side, a sadness with lots of demonstrations and road closures in protest of that law on the other. And then the third thing was the environmental issues that are so alive in India today. And for decades, I've been observing, returning to India, looking for signs of improvement, seeing signs of improvement, seeing horrible things that continue to be perpetuated. And while we were there during Durga Puja, and we went to Kashmir Gate, which is the Bengali neighborhood of Delhi, and they, of course, had the huge bundles of, 10 times human-sized images of Durga. And this was the first time in Delhi that they enacted legislation that, no, she will not be brought down to the Yamuna. The Yamuna has enough trouble without being suffused with the lead paints that decorate these images of Durga. And they had 150 ponds, special, like portable swimming pools, specially constructed all throughout the city. And in the Kashmir Gate ceremony, they got this big crane, they lifted Durga, and then they dumped her in this aluminum swimming pool. And the papers reported that unlike last year, when the heavy metal content in the Yamuna went even higher, they captured that heavy metal. And again, that was a sign of ingenuity, creativity, and positivity. So I end this paper by invoking, it's too small for me to read there, but Haribhadra said, as long as your intent is good, keep going. And what I do in this article, which you will be able to read, is interlace this translation of a 6th century text with anecdotes of experiences within India that particular time in 2019. So what we're aiming for in this journal is readability, visual content, thoughtfulness, and all of your contributions moving forward. So thank you, and we're open for questions. And I want to welcome Bryce Yoder, who is here for the next big event. I want to welcome my colleague, Anna Harrison, who was born in Mumbai. And yeah, so we have, Bryce did 6 months as a gap year within Auroville. So glad that you're with us. So one question, and then we're going to take a stand walking up around break. The restrooms are down that long hallway, and there's a water fountain over there as well. Following this, at the rise of this event, you're all invited to dinner at India Taj Palace, compliments of the Doshi Fund. And if you don't know where it is, let me know. Okay, so before we go into our next event, yes, Naveen.
I have a question for Professor Deepak Shimkara.
Shimkada. Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. So Deepak Bhai, did I miss in your presentation temple of Pashupati Shiva?
Yes, I did not mention that. Why did you bring that up?
I've been on the outside of that beautiful temple, and anyone who sees it can never forget it. At the heart of Kathmandu.
Yeah, there is also a step down structure, which I call yoni, and the secret rites gets into done, especially young girls, that they also do a lot of, Nepal is as you know, is a tantric country, right? But I was focusing on this particular royal bath, which was a problem. I wanted to, tackle the name and also its meaning. So that is why I did not include. You are correctly right. There are a lot of structures like that, step well in Kathmandu all over. Right next to Pashupatinath, there is one. And I have a nice picture of that, which I used for another article a long time ago. Thank you for bringing that up.
Just to carry on, the old city, most of the structures were the photos of the structures in the old city, right? Of Nepal's big city. What is that? Kathmandu.
Kathmandu.
Did you get the question? Shall I repeat?
Yes.
Okay. You showed most of the photos are of, I believe they're all wooden structures, right?
Wooden and brick, yes.
I see, okay. And that is of the old city of Kathmandu.
Right,
Also,
right. From Lalitpur is the old name. Today it is called Patan, not to be confused with Patan in Gujarat. But again, among the 3 cities in the valley, Bhaktapur, which is called Bhatgaon today, is the oldest, and then Patan is this second oldest, and Kathmandu, which we call Basantapur, Kathmandu, is the youngest of all the 3 in terms of historical chronology.
Well, very good. I have a special request of Lane to open the computer and show our viewing audience. I request our present audience to stand up and look out at the sunset. Yeah, we're doing the shades up now. The sun will no longer trouble us.
you should give a bit of a commentary saying if there is a heaven, this is it. Right?
If there's a heaven, this is it.
Right, right.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So Lane, can they see the sunset?
They did, yes.
Oh, good. And we're right close to the fall equinox. And this is also a reminder that this sun will be setting at 7 tomorrow.
Spring, Chris.
Spring, right, spring equinox, the spring equinox, yes.
All right, wonderful.
Well done. Thank you for orchestrating that.
Yeah. Doing it at the right place at the right
It
time.
was one of the best things to study in his life. The sunset. It's true.
We have to wait for the green flash.
So we're on a break, are we?
Correct.
Right, and we do have refreshments. There are tangerines in the tangerine colored barrel and the white barrel. So again, I want to invite Akash Kapur to come up and Robert McDermott to come up. I also want to welcome Eliza Kent, who has joined us on screen from Skidmore College, where I think it's cold. Yeah.
This is compost or not?
Chris, is there a compass?
Just
Just put it in there.
just put it in there. Yeah.
Hey, good morning.
Yeah.
Enjoying the sunset on this side.
Just the three of us.
Igor is here, right?
Yeah.
Oh, in the morning. Yeah. Wow. Not so.
Do you want an orange? So, Robert. Okay, let's go. Yeah. Yes.
I don't think that should be. There's some patients like find something new, but not
No, she said.
No.
Yeah, that's true.
Actually, I ate, I fortified myself with food before coming.
Yes.
Can I have a word with you? I'm not.
Yeah, go back down to Lincoln and go way down and then okay.
You have a bit of a body movement that.
I've got three, but one of them is only every other week. Okay. Everything I've done in my life is I didn't 6 years of work.
We were just talking about that's okay. It's good. Yeah. Many respect.
He had
that restaurant failed. Actually, weeks. But they told me they still based there.
Yeah. So I know I did some articles about his adaptations.
It's a vegetarian. Amazing. I had dinner at 12 over 8.
Well, where did you find all this?
And it was like,
You're in this. Because I wanted Okay, I want to welcome everybody back. And this is a true highlight, particularly for my wife and myself. My wife speaking to Navin Doshi, our wonderful supporter of all programs here. So when we read about this book in the New York Times, we said, oh, we got to get this, because during the Fulbright, we spent part of our time in Auroville, very nicely set up by Professor Banerji here. And my own recollections of Auroville go back to early teenage years when we heard the great vision of this utopian city. And I don't know if any of you know about Arcosanti in Arizona, but a little bit of it was built. And this idea back in the day that we would build a better world and we would all live together in harmony with one another, oh, it made our hearts soar. And my wife and I, when we were teenagers, became part of a yoga community and started studying Sanskrit. And we read the works of Sri Aurobindo and followed rather avidly the stories of Auroville's development. And most of all, to this day, we prize Orishiko incense. So one of the cottage industry products of that community. And as we read this book aloud to one another, we gasped, because this is a little bit like the ultimate of utopianism. And by that, I'm referring to that Rolling Stones concert where people got really battered, if not killed. And it really was, on the one hand, holding out hope for what we all want, which is love, peace, and harmony, but pointing a finger at the fragility of the human psyche. And I highly recommend this book. It will open you in ways that are unfolding, because we're all human beings doing the best we can. And what we're going to do today is respond to some reflections offered by Debashish. And I now turn this to Debashish.
So, Chris, I had a little PowerPoint. Do you know?
Yeah, Lane, can we share the PowerPoint?
So I had a little PowerPoint for those who don't know, don't have much background, just a little introduction to what we're talking about. Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
I feel a bit difficult. I think. Yeah. Yeah, very good. So we have over here on this table, we have Professor Robert McDermott. He's Emeritus President of California Institute of Integral Studies. Chris Chapple, who needs no introduction. Eliza Kent, on the a person who's environmentalist, professor who's written about Auroville and the environmental work that it's done. And Akash Kapur, who's the author of the book that's being discussed today. And the book, the book is up there. You can see in the slideshow, it's called Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Auroville. And Auroville was, the time period that Akash is talking about is about from 1975 to 1980 or so. Am I right? Or even a little less than that. A window of what, 4 or 5 years? Yeah. And so, next slide, please. And so Auroville is founded by Mira Alfasa, also known as the mother, the spiritual collaborator of Sri Aurobindo, who I just talked about. And so this community is an international community with some kind of a vision for the future of humanity. Next slide, please. And so some of the ideas behind it is that the purpose of life is spiritual being and becoming, not having. The ideal of human unity. In other words, many cultures can live together and find a point of unity. It would be a city-state with a small footprint, communitarian relations, collective self-government, which has sometimes been called spiritual anarchism. In other words, government from bottom up, but with spiritual experience behind it. A moneyless economy, controlled for production, cottage industry, and for internal consumption mainly, and with organic architecture, agriculture. Ecological harmony through land and water restoration, greening, and sustainable architecture. Now, these were not necessarily in the ideals spelled out, but this, in a sense, is what the vision has become. And technology at the service of ecological and spiritual living. The ideal of Auroville was spelled out by the mother in 1968 when it was founded in a charter called the Charter of Auroville, which is featured in the book. Auroville belongs to nobody in particular. Auroville belongs to humanity as a whole, but to live in Auroville, one must be a willing servitor of the divine consciousness. Auroville will be a place of unending education, of constant progress, and a youth that never ages. Auroville wants to be the bridge between the past and the future, taking advantage of all discoveries from without and from within. Auroville will boldly spring towards future realizations. Auroville will be a site of material and spiritual researches for a living embodiment of an actual human unity. These are the ideals as spelled out in the Charter of Auroville. So in 1968, Auroville was founded. This is a photograph of the euphoric event of its founding. As you can see, Auroville at that time looked like this. And you have some photographs as well in Akash's book. It was completely barren, a wilderness with hardly any, all the land had been leached off into the waters. There was nothing there. It was meant to be built around a meditation chamber, which is considered to be the soul of the city, an architectural soul, so to speak, which didn't belong to anybody, but people could take as their own, in a sense, their own inner experience. Now, the timeline of this book starts after the mother's passing, but before that, the mother set up something called the Sri Aurobindo Society in 1960, with herself as the president. This was done because the property was in Tamil Nadu. Pondicherry itself is a union territory, and to collect money, you needed a foundation of some kind. So Sri Aurobindo Society was given administrative charge of the Auroville project. It did fundraising and registered itself as the legal owner of all the lands purchased. The mother passed in 1973. After that, there was conflict between the residents and the Sri Aurobindo Society, which attempted to control Auroville. In 1976, there was a commission to investigate the Sri Aurobindo Society, and it found irregularities. In 1980, the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi promulgated the Auroville Emergency Provisions Ordinance, shortly afterwards followed by the Auroville Emergency Provisions Act, in 1980. The management of all undertakings relatable to Auroville was vested in the government of India at that point. The appointment of an administrator and an internal advisory council. The content of the Emergency Act, which this Foundation Act, there was a Foundation Act in 1988, which established the takeover by the government of India of all undertakings of Auroville. And the Auroville Foundation Act of 1991, according to that, the assets were transferred on April 1st, 1992. And the governance was controlled by three authorities: a governing board consisting of 7 eminent Indians and 2 ex-officio members, an international advisory council of 5 members, a residents assembly, which included all people of Auroville above the age of 18, and the residents assembly would appoint a working committee. And there was a secretary who was the IAS officer. Now, this is how it looks. This is the Matri Mandir, which is the soul of Auroville, the architectural soul of Auroville. That wilderness that you looked at, this is what it looks like now. And the population, there are 3,305 residents of 60 nationalities. You get a certain sense of they're from all over. And a little few of the increase in population. The period that Akash is talking about, you had probably about 200 to 300 people. So this is the period he's talking about when the timeline I spoke about is going on. The conflict between Sri Aurobindo Society and the residents is going on. And in that environment, there are events happening which have to do with some people very closely known, Akash's wife, her mother, and her foster father, both of whom died in the story. So this is the background of the book, and we'll discuss Auroville at that point a little bit through a few questions, and you're free to ask some at the end. So my first question related to Auroville then and now. All our panelists have visited Auroville in recent times. Did you know of the dark chapter that Akash's book discusses? What is, yes. Okay.
I'm just curious how many people here, first of all, thank you all for the introduction, for having me here. How many of you have been to Auroville? I'm just curious. Good. Quite a few people. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Sure. What is your impression of Auroville now in comparison with its beginnings as described in the book? Are the ideals of the 60s counterculture that it talks about, since 1968, all the Western counterculture, many people going there, is that still alive in some way as you think of it and see it now? If anybody wants to, you can pass.
Yeah, I could, but someone else could as well.
You go first.
So, I haven't lived there. I've only visited 4 or 5 times, first in 1970. So I've been tracking it from the distance from friends. I have a suspicion that it is like many large groups or institutions, that a single word is almost inevitably not helpful or accurate. You almost always need quite a few words to account for the range of people who are enlightened and spiritual and dedicated, all the way over to people who are self-delusional, who are selfish, and who are not creative and are sort of being carried. And lots of people in the middle. So I think of the years that you are talking about are very much adolescent years. And Auroville was the kind of community that you could say has a history, but I think it's truer to say it has a biography. Not only that, it has a spiritual biography. So it has many levels and dimensions, complexities. And so that's why I'm talking about it, but I'm also not answering.
Eliza, would you like to say something?
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, Akash, thank you so much for this amazing book. And I really appreciate having the chance to be on this panel. And I'm sorry I'm coming, through the magic of Zoom and not there in person. I first went to Auroville, I think in 1993 when I was a language student in India. And then I went back again kind of as a tourist, stayed for a little rest and relaxation. And again, when I was studying in Tamil Nadu in 1997, and then I went back in 2001 and began doing more systematic study of the work of Pachandikulam, one of the units that's really focused on environmental restoration. And one thing that I will say, I mean, I remember when I first went there, it resonated so deeply with me. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I've spent a lot of time in Bolinas, which I know you mentioned in your book. And it was like, wow, this is so familiar. And I will say that it has changed so much. I mean, the building of the East Coast Road, the rise of a totally different economy in India, the liberalization of the economy, the price of land has gone through the roof. It's a very different place now. And in the last chapters, Akash, you speak in such a fascinating way about being resentful of the tourists who now swarm the city and people who come and enjoy the restaurants that are there. So it's changed a lot. And I'm interested to know, how do you build a utopia? How do you foster that, kind of hopeful and progressive spirit when you're not kind of on the lonely plateau anymore, but it's become very crowded now. But I fell in love with the place, and it is an incredibly inspiring place. And I also just will say one more thing, which is that I really appreciated the ways that I had known about this conflict between the kind of the Sri Aurobindo Society and the Aurovillians. But I think your book really opened up how much that was kind of a civil conflict as well within the Aurovillian community, and just kind of exposing how painful that was for many, folks, including the neutrals, was really terrific. It was really important.
Yeah, I just want people to know that there's death in the book. Tragic death of children and tragic death of people who should be with us today that made bad decisions. And that I had no idea when I was in Auroville of that aspect of the history. And it just raises the question, what do we do with our idealism?
Pass it on to Akash. Have this say on this.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot there. So I guess I could respond maybe in a personal way to what Eliza said, right? Eliza talked about the changes she witnessed as somebody that was doing research there. And, the thing I want to say is that the book has the elements that Debashish outlined, kind of the Civil War, the governance structures and all that, but it's a very, very personal book. It's about my growing up in Auroville. It's about my wife growing up there. It's about the death of her parents and siblings, as he said, whose fates were sort of enmeshed with the collective social history and fate of Auroville. So I just want to respond personally to those changes. to the changes that she mentioned, to say that absolutely those changes are very true, and anybody who is in Auroville in those early years has felt them, and I think are individually and collectively struggling to adapt to them. Because when I was growing up in Auroville, when I was a kid, I mean, we were at the end of the world, right? Like the joke was, you know, like you would be kind of running around like some wild Mowgli kid on the road, and then you would see some sweaty, red-faced tourist, and they'd say, like, "Where's the city? Where's the city?" And you say, "Well, you are in the city." and it was like there was nothing going on, and it was a pretty hard place, as some of the stories of the pioneers and the founders refer to. You know, we barely had electricity. There was certainly no restaurants. Like running water was a thing. And then Auroville changed, but India changed. India became a much wealthier country. She referred to the East Coast Highway. You know, population has grown. People's disposable income has grown, so people want second homes in the countryside. Auroville has also created a very kind of hospitable, green kind of environment where people want to build their second homes. And so all of this has created pressures on this community. And these pressures are complicated. Like it's true that in the book, I sort of, as a curmudgeonly resident of Auroville, I don't want the tourists to be there. But as some of the critics of the book pointed out, it's like, well, you know, it's in India, and you know, Auroville can't be a wildlife sanctuary that's isolated from the rest of India. So these are like pressures from the rest of the country coming in. But it does raise the question of how do you create a spiritual, anti-materialistic community that is somehow built in opposition to this, for lack of a better word, capitalist economy, when the capitalist economy is crushing down on you and breathing down on you, most tangibly in real estate prices, but in many ways, right? In all the restaurants that have come up. And I don't, you know, I don't think that question has been settled. I think it's something that everybody's really grappling with. For me personally, I say somewhere in the book, well, you know, I went to school in America and I moved back there partly because I sort of wanted space to be a writer and do my yoga or whatever trip I was on. But I say at some point, I say, like, I've learned that inner space needs outer space. And it shouldn't be that way. You know, you should be able to be a cloistered monk in the middle of a city, but it's something that I personally have been struggling with. Thank you.
Another question that I had has to do with Westerners in India. And as the book discusses, there are a number of interactions between Westerners and Indians. You have both rural Indians and urban ones who belong both to the ashram and to the Sri Aurobindo Society. Even now, when I take students sometimes to Auroville, they wonder what these Westerners are doing in India. What is the fit? So on the other hand, the ideals of Auroville are, as we saw, they're based on the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. They're already there in those teachings. But somehow they came into existence at a time when many Westerners arrived. So the question I have is, do you feel that the stakes for these ideals are more relevant to the Westerners than to the Indians? What does this imply for the community?
That's not my question.
Eliza, would you like to say anything about this?
I would be glad to. Yeah, you know, I've been giving that some thought as well, and I do think that that's one of the real tensions of that community is the sort of I don't know, the hard to completely refute sense that there's a kind of neo-colonialism going on there, that there's a kind of a presence of Westerners on this land that, you know, how did it end up in the hands of so many Westerners? And sometimes I've wondered why Aurovillians didn't sort of try harder to learn Tamil and I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of social work organizations that grew up in Auroville, and again, the Mother's guidance provides a kind of context for interacting with Tamilians, and I think one of the things that she says is, you know, they're the hosts, we're the guests here, and yet I just feel like that it's like the Aurovillians seem like they're so into their own trip, as you say, Akash, that they don't kind of stop to really learn more about the lives of the Tamilians around them. Yeah, and I just, again, I feel like that's one of these tensions that remains unresolved and must be, you know, a challenge for present day Aurovillians to deal with.
I think the term neocolonialism is a hard word to kind of discuss in this situation, particularly because these people, they're really coming away from the capitalist economy. On the other hand, perhaps much of the environment is still invested in that kind of economy. And the ideals have still not grown in a very substantial sense in the environment. I don't know. So I'm wondering.
It is a tough one, and it's something I've thought about all my life as somebody who's half Indian, half American. And it's something I've thought about more since the book came out, because people asked this question, and I would say it was the most common sort of criticism of Auroville that came up. I mean, look, on the one hand, I would put the favorable sort of position for Auroville is this. Well, first of all, the facts are that 50% of the community is Indian, 50% is non-Indian, roughly. We call it an international city. So if it is an international city dedicated to international human unity, I don't know that that goal would be well served by having a community that was 90% any nationality. So I think there's a reason why it's people from all over the world. That being said, well, and one further fact, I would say that the relationship with the villages around there has been complicated, and in some ways has definitely been exploitative, but also has been very beneficial. And many people from the local villages have joined Auroville and have created new identities. Also, many Indians from other parts of India, people move to Auroville. They find it liberating in ways that sort of like tradition and culture, especially for women, sometimes feel very bound by culture in the rest of India and feel more liberated in Auroville. So anyway, so that's the positive case, and I think it's true. I also think it's true that certainly at an individual level, I wouldn't call it neo-colonial, but maybe sort of like there's a settler mentality there, kind of frontier settler mentality sometimes, that I've been in situations that I personally find very off-putting. There's also a phenomenon where people would come to Auroville straight, let's say from the West, and so have the only reality they know in India is Auroville, and they have no familiarity with the rest of India or Indian culture, and that's problematic. I guess like one thing, your question was about like, are the stakes of these ideals more relevant to Westerners? And I think the answer to that is no. I think definitely not. And I would just highlight, for example, the green work that's being done in Auroville and the ecological restoration work that's being done in Auroville, which to my mind is sort of the most impressive work that's been done there in the last 50 years. And Eliza, you referred to your work in Pichandiculam, which I know well because I actually lived there when I was a kid, and I know Joss Brooks, who's an Australian that's planted up that area. And this is somebody who has done amazing ecological restoration work despite having no formal training in this or anything. That work is now being, for lack of a better word, exported from Auroville and being used in other parts of India. For example, restoration of waterways in Chennai, where he was hired by the Tamil Nadu government to do this kind of work. And so I think anybody who has been to India recently knows that the country has a real environmental calamity in front of it, that it's suffering ecologically. That's extremely sad. The same way we're talking about the changes in Auroville, the changes in India as a country are very sad that way. And I think that Auroville being a sort of leader in green work and ecological innovation, that ideal is highly, highly relevant to India.
Thanks, Akash.
Lay.
We have a question on this microscope that came in. Someone's asking, last week there was an article in the New York Times about the conflict between those who want to maintain the natural environment or Auroville. Could you talk about the current situation?
Would anybody like to take this?
Well, the New York Times, in rather interesting detail, talks about this standoff that I'm sure you know firsthand about.
Yeah, well, okay, so the sort of symptom of the standoff or the proximate conflict is over the town plan. There was a plan created for Auroville 53 years ago when it was being founded by the mother. It was this sort of big plan for a big city, a planned city in the mold of, the Chandigarh or Brasilia. It was a kind of high modernist moment. Much of that city has not emerged for a variety of reasons physically. And what has emerged instead is this kind of like organic forest that has come up in the place of much of the city. And so there's been a long-standing conflict in the community. In fact, when I was researching the book, I was surprised by how far it went, because this is going way back to when the mother was still alive, that there's these fights between what one character in the book calls the constructionists and the organicists. And these two visions of how a new city should emerge. Should it emerge by plan, or should it emerge kind of organically from ground up in the effort? And these tensions have simmered and recently have resurfaced in a pretty ugly way, pretty unpleasant way, because it's created a lot of conflict within the community. And yeah, it's not just in the New York Times, but in articles all over the media, The Guardian, and all kinds of places. I guess like my take on this, rather than getting at the kind of like proximate issue of the conflict, I think what's lacking here in Auroville, what the community has never successfully developed, is a government structure and a decision-making system to resolve these types of conflicts. You refer to spiritual anarchy or divine anarchy, which is much easier to kind of handle when there are 100 people in the community and everybody gets together in a room and starts shouting, and basically whoever shouts loudest gets their way. I mean, that's the way it kind of functions. But then when you get to a community of 3,000 people, you're obviously going to have differences. And it's facile and simplistic to say, oh, well, we should make decisions by consensus because we're here for human unity. I mean, you don't put 3,000 people in a room together and expect to achieve human unity. We know what human nature is like, right? So we have these differences, and we don't have the institutions, and we don't have the capacity to resolve these differences. And that raises a whole bunch of questions about these intentional communities. How do they grow beyond being small little kind of like collections of individuals to institutions, or they're having kind of collective mechanisms? Frankly, I think having those mechanisms is the only way out of this impasse in the community.
Quite a few questions I have. Let's see. One is, one of the worst problems India has water shortage. And from what I remember by visiting, Auroville has a very good technology, so to speak, to be water sufficient. There are no external sources of water, if I remember. So is there any kind of support that Auroville could give? The reason I ask is, and Chris, you remember, we have established a chair, research at IIT Gandhinagar on water research. But I don't see any kind of interaction. So that's number one question. Number two, again, it goes back to the same thing. Interaction could go, in other words, joining hands could go a long way. Exchanging also information on different environmental technology. So that's number two. Number three, the dome, the golden dome of the soul of Auroville. I'm a gold buff, so any significance? I've written a book called Gold, Sun Incarnate. And is there any significance why it has been, what shall I say? They have a coating of a pure gold, if I understand right, if I remember right.
I honestly don't know the gold question. I don't know what the significance is. I know that was the plan, but I don't know what the significance is. I think the water question is a great question. And you're absolutely right that Auroville, part of the sort of genius of its ecological restoration was figuring out how to harness natural rainfall. It has no external water bodies. When Auroville is on a plateau, and so when it was founded, it was this totally barren, arid desert because it would rain and it would flow off the plateau, and all the topsoil would be wiped away, and it was this kind of hard desert. And so these people who subsequently have derided as like hippies, but I think they're heroes, they show up, and again, like none of them have formal ecological training. In fact, there's not much ecological consciousness in the world at this time, right? I mean, these people are very much forerunners in this way. And so out of necessity, not any kind of like scientific vision, they're like, we need to live here, we need to survive here, we need food, we need shade. And so they start bonding the land and they start building little check dams. And effectively they, sort of in this ad hoc, quote unquote, hippie way, build this amazing way to harness rainwater and to create this amazing forest, which I think, inarguably one of the most successful, if not the most successful reforestation project in India now. And that obviously would be highly beneficial to many parts of India. And it's being done, like some of that knowledge is being shared locally in the villages, in terms of desilting water bodies, and people are going out there and doing it. But yeah, it probably hasn't been done at the scale that it could be done in a systematized way that you sort of reference.
So I have a suggestion. You're a young man.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
No, so all this experience and knowledge of I give one example is I'm also connected well with MIU, the Maharishi International University. They're decentralized. So young men like yourself and people of your age should decentralize all this knowledge, collected knowledge, and use everywhere in the Mother Earth, I guess.
I agree. I do agree.
Okay.
Especially with the young part.
Speaking of young, I wonder, Bryce, if you could just say what your project was and your impressions as a young person escaping Syracuse University, and what effect it had upon you.
Yeah, so I was at a farm called Terrasol, and it was a permaculture farm, so very much focused on working within the constraints that nature
Come a little
provides.
bit closer so the mic can pick you up for Eliza.
And it was fascinating. I went there because I was at Syracuse and I was studying business, and I just knew that something was very, very wrong. I didn't entirely know what. And so I read about Auroville a little bit, and I wanted to go, and I didn't really know what I was expecting, but I learned a lot about who I was, and I sort of fell in love with nature. And so I think that there is, young people are going to do what young people are going to do, but I still think that there is a lot of value to answer the question previously, maybe a little bit from my perspective as a young person that lived in Auroville. I don't know what the culture was before, but I know that I still got an incredible amount of value as somebody who was coming from the West and didn't entirely value the ideals, and learned a lot about where my place was in the world.
Where do you hope to go now?
I've been thinking about it for a while, and I have no idea.
Good.
I'd love to buy a van and travel around the national parks in the US. So,
It leads us to our next question, which is about the spiritual community. This is not just any community, it's a spiritual community. This was also happening quite a lot at that period. We see spirituality having an important part to play in many communes of that period. Many of them have Indian or some Western gurus at their center. The values of faith, obedience, and surrender to gurus run counter to the ideal of individual freedom so important to the modern West. It is also often a recipe for authoritarian control and abuse. So in this case, what you see, what is the nature of the spiritual sort of center? And does it lead to any conflicts of this kind, any problems of this kind? Robert?
I could say something.
Yeah.
It's a great question. it accompanied me throughout the entire book. What is the nature of the negative influence that we read about? And is it entirely human? Or is it more than human? Some of the more than human seems positive, and some of the more than human seems negative. And who can tell the difference? And so I find that part of the story intriguing and really important. So there's a person named Chapple who has a direct influence on the two people who died, that they shouldn't have medical treatment. And he becomes a sort of larger than life person, a charismatic and influential, and a person who seems to know and has some special access. And indeed, he was very close to the mother. The mother dictated her process of transforming cells of her body to that very person. And then turns out I viewed him very negatively. That's what you were very. Yeah, but it was also sensitive. I thought it was very nuanced in quite an admirable way. Because I'm ready to tear them apart and just think, well, yes, I never am, and you're completely right about that. So I don't have an easy answer to this, but I do think that it's at least possible that Chapple was taken over by a negative force. Auroville talks about a negative force that broke his leg. So a negative force can break Auroville's leg. I think it can break any leg, and more than a leg. So it's a little bit like, people like Auroville and Carl Jung decided that the rise of the Third Reich was a more than human catastrophe. It was in the level of psyche. It was in a higher level, deeper, octuple, and hard to know and even harder to control. But as we read in the book again and again, it depends on the receptivity of the community. These archetypes are active, but they need a host. Sri Aurobindo says that for the spiritual age to come, we need leaders, we need spiritual teachers, and we need people to receive and to implement and advance. Well, I don't know the answer to this, but I know the question because I had it on every page. Where is this coming from? Are there negative forces working on Auroville and trying to prevent the human evolution, and particularly at a spiritual level? So I just pass that on as a genuine existential question. And we don't have many people who know the spiritual sources of unusual events and unusual phenomena. And when we get one, we tend to pay attention. And that's what happened. We pay attention to the mother because she seemed to know. And Aurobindo seemed to know. So I don't have a moment's criticism of anybody who said they seem to know better than other people. But everybody who said they know able to handle that level of. So I had a friend who was a chair of a board and said one day in a moment of impatience, all faculties are bad, except when they're spiritual, and then they're worse. And that was very clever. And I thought, that's really nasty, until I thought about it. The reason they are sometimes worse is because there are no guardrails. They're trying to do something at two different levels. It's very, very hard. And that's what I think about all of this, working on two levels. And it's very hard. We just don't know. Like, City University of New York, everybody knew it was about power and money. Auroville is more complicated than that. It's about spiritual and power and money. That's how I read. And I thought the book, just let me say, I think the book is actually subtly brilliant. He doesn't preach at us.
Subtly brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, if you're alert to the question, he handles it very, very well. it's a hard question to deal with. What do you do with a Sat Prem?
Eliza, you have anything to say about this?
Maybe we can make Eliza large for this plane.
Thank you. Now I get to speak like the Wizard of Oz or something. I actually, again, I thought that was one of the most brilliant moves that the book makes. I really appreciated the way that you showed how Sat Prem kind of reframes the conflicts that erupted after the mother's death as a matter of kind of cosmological, cosmos style conflict between good and evil, and sort of taking very prosaic, mundane quarrels like who's going to manage and administer this property, will you get a visa approved or not? And, taking these issues and blowing them up till they're, matters of life and death. And also the sort of, reframing Diane's life, through the lens of this cosmic struggle, is the work of religion in some ways, right? It's to suffuse the everyday with this other, extra energy, and that has a diabolical quality to it sometimes too, a very harmful quality. And yet, isn't that also what's going on with the green work? That the green work is also ennobled and elevated by seeing it through the lens of Aurobindo's amazing, and the mother's amazing religious vision of bringing life out of matter, and bringing consciousness out of life, and then bringing some kind of super consciousness, out of that consciousness. I mean, that's so inspiring. That's religion too, right? That's religious discourse kind of ennobling things. So I guess I think Sat Prem is a fascinating figure, and it seems to me that in some ways he sort of represents, the way in which religion can be very divisive, can exacerbate divisions in a way that's, harmful.
Yeah, thank you. Chris? Oh, so many thoughts. When I teach, I consider Debashish the best modern interpreter of Sri Aurobindo. And when I teach his book, which I do every year for the past several years, called The Seven Quartets, is it? Yeah. And he has done the deep dive into trying to figure out what is the spirituality at the core of the Aurobindo movement. And the phrase that I keep coming back to is the descent of consciousness. And what the folks did, and including Akash's parents, was to invite this new way of earth relations. And as Eliza describes in the book, and as we saw from the photographs, totally transformed landscape. And this project of ecological restoration is more than metaphorical, because it's what we need to be able to accomplish to survive. These people have done it in a very intellectual way. And reading Aurobindo's story, I mean, he was taken, like we're reflecting a bit about the poor American children that were put away in the Hare Krishna boarding schools, or put away in the Yogi Bhajan boarding schools in India, and they grew up sort of feral. But think of Sri Aurobindo. He was taken out of India and told, you must become an agent of empire. And he totally rebelled against that. So rather than coming up with a defined response, I do want to quote one of my mentors here at the university, very powerful, overbearing woman who empowered me in so many different ways. Her name is Jody Fisher. She is no more. And she said, power corrupts. And this was, I think, a little bit of what the book is about. The people who took power used that power over the psyches of others in ways that were not always good. And one of the takeaways for me was that be moderate in, it made me an Aristotelian, just be moderate in diet. If you need some medicine, take the medicine. And to me, that's pretty good spiritual advice. And I found the book immensely inspiring in its practicality.
I I think let's go through the round. You want to say something? Okay.
May I?
So yes.
Yeah. I had a brief visit to Auroville 2 years ago, right before COVID. And I remember thinking then, and then it was reinforced when I read Akash's book and interviewed him, that one of the most salient things about Auroville is that it still exists. It survived. There were so many communal experiments that started at the same time that are long gone. And yet this is more than 50 years, 2 generations. It's mere survival despite all the drama and all the conflict and everything else is pretty remarkable when you think about it. And so I'm wondering what you think about the reasons for its very survival. And I'm also curious about how children born in Auroville, and when they grow up, how many stay? How many, take off for wherever?
I'm also interested in that question, but let's hold it just for a moment because we haven't really finished the question about cult figures and power. I'd like to have Akash's response to that as well. And I also wanted to say it's really a kind of the crux of the book, and it's really at the crux of our time as well. And it's an ongoing problem. Do we just be rationalists and go by a kind of common sense idea or understanding of what should lead us in our life? Or do we listen to these guru figures who sometimes say outrageous things? And that's going on. It's going on even now. I mean, it's a tremendously problematic area. And so I think, maybe, as you said, common sense has a lot to play with it, knowing where to draw the line and not jumping overboard if you don't know where you want to go or what is the power you have, the receptivity of the person. What would be your answer?
So much there. So first, I just want to say, Robert, when you were talking about Satran, whom all of you have raised the role of Satran, and he had this sort of light in him, as many other women would say, because of his exposure to the mother. Don't forget that how his life essentially began. He was a French resistance fighter. He was captured by the Nazis. He was tortured by the Gestapo. He spent many years in 2 concentration camps. And so, to the extent that you believe in dark forces and asuras and things like that, that's where the darkness came from. And he was somebody that carried that with him. So I just wanted to say that, on this sort of question of like spirituality and its benign but also pernicious effect, rather than thinking of it from the top-down role of gurus, I think the way it's most directly addressed in the book is at the very personal level of faith, right? The central characters in the book who essentially die because they believed too much and because they had too much faith. And that for me was really like the core of the project, was to understand where on the spectrum of faith, which begins as such a noble idealistic impulse to create a better world, the central character John, who rejects the kind of materialism and all the privilege of his family to move to Auroville to build this new world and this beautiful quest, where does he cross the line into dying this horrible, unnecessary death on a concrete floor by a canyon? And that was really that's what I was grappling with in the book, and I don't have an answer to it, you know. And as you, those of you who read the book, I myself am grappling with my own relationship to faith and rationality in the book. But you know, I quote Thomas Merton in there somewhere, who talks about sort of faith and rationality existing on a spectrum and on a continuum, and that we all sort of exist somewhere on that continuum. And I think somewhere on that continuum is also a mostly invisible line, and probably highly individualistic also, where you cross over from the light into the darkness, basically. And the lesson that I took away from this book was just that you need to be aware of both of these things. For many people in Auroville, I would say they're maybe too attuned to the light of faith, and they need to be aware of the darkness. I had almost the opposite problem, having grown up in Auroville. You know, growing up in a place like Auroville can often make you very cynical, because you see so many ideals proclaimed in the name of faith and spirituality, and you see the sort of human manifestations. So I had almost the opposite experience, which really surprised me, which is that I began from a place of skepticism, knowing that people had died because of too much faith, knowing all these horrible things that had happened in the community because of too much faith and too much sort of spiritual belief. But then, as I was reading John's letters and I'm reading the diaries of these early Aurovillians, I really found myself opening up to the kind of the beauty of their quest and the nobility of their quest. And by the end of it, I'm in a place where I'm like the only one who questions whether his death was even as unnecessary and as tragic as everyone else seems to think it is, you know. And I have this conversation with my wife, you know, where I'm sort of trying to convince her that her parents died and it was horrible, but it had meaning and it had purpose, and the sort of quest gave their life coherence. And she just sort of looking at me and just, they died, they're dead. Like, what are you talking about? So I crossed the line the other way, you know, in the course of writing the book. But anyway, the point is that this dance, or this sort of delicate exchange, I think, is really at the core of the project for me.
Maureen, I think Maureen,
Really good answer.
Okay.
I have lots of questions, so
I think let's take Phil's question first.
okay, yeah.
Akash.
The question was, why has it survived? Yeah, so I completely agree with the premise of the question. I think that, I mean, it's amazing that Auroville is still around, not just because of the conflict it suffered, but because I think the world, as I say, now militates against places like Auroville. Like, the world as it is does everything it can to crush a place like Auroville, right? Like money, power, all the stuff that we know. It's like stamp out this weird little bug before it infects the rest of us, right? And so I think it's amazing that Auroville is still around, and I give a lot of points for that. As to the question of why, you know, many reasons. For me, one of the most important factors is precisely this kind of, the thing I was criticizing earlier, which is the lack of a kind of governance structure, the kind of divine anarchy. Well, let me take that back. Not the lack of a governance structure, the lack of a very hierarchical top-down leadership, which is what many of these communities have, where there's, you know, people often ask me, like, are there rules in Auroville, or is it a cult? And I say, no, there are no rules. And sometimes people think that's weird and that Auroville, like, is too anarchic because it doesn't have rules. I think that's what allowed it to survive, because I think it's what allows it to sort of weave its way organically and to find its way. And often the way these projects collapse, whether they're small communities or whether they're grand utopian projects like communism, they essentially collapse because the ideals run up against the complexity and the ambiguity and the ambivalence of human nature, and it just doesn't cohere anymore, and the whole thing crumbles. And because Auroville never had, except for its very, very early years when the mother was around, it never had this kind of like clear leadership. It never had rigid guidelines or rules. It allowed for all kinds of, you know, complexity and ambiguity into the community. I think that's why it's still around. And I hope that continues. I hope that the community is able to sort of find its way, evolve and weave its way through as the world changes around it, that the community is able to evolve itself.
Maureen.
Yeah, thank you so much for your book, and it is such a personal and vulnerable book, so I just want to acknowledge that. I'm wondering how the book's been received in your community, and part of that wondering is around, is there a sense of the history with the current residents? Some of who were born when all this was going on, and then drilling down a little bit, like, what are children taught about what the project is? And I guess my last question is, how much spiritual training, how much connection is there to actually the original spirituality that inspired the community?
Yeah, so in terms of the book's reception, obviously, when I was writing the book, I was nervous, I mean, I was nervous because I'm a member of the community. And if you write about a small town, leave alone all the complexity of Auroville, you're going to be nervous. And it felt, I don't know, like people came up to me and said, you were so courageous, and I'm like, that's funny. I don't know if you've ever called me courageous in my life before. But I guess I was without knowing it. But it's funny, like I would, overall, the reception has been way better than I would have anticipated. Not everyone's happy with it. And I think it's a bit of a generational divide. I think older residents of Auroville are less happy with me than younger residents because they maybe feel that they lived through some of those years and I missed out some of the nuances of the struggle. And they're probably right. But many younger people, and by that I mean like 50 and under, who were kids when they lived through those times, have come up to me and said, well, thank you for writing that history. Like I knew that these events had happened, but thank you for kind of cohering it into a narrative. For part of writing history is taking these isolated incidents and understanding how they sort of lead into each other. So the reception's been positive overall, and I want to say that that's very heartening to me, because not just because an author likes to be praised, but because people ask me, they say, "Oh, is Auroville a cult?" And the strongest answer I have to that is no, because I get to write a book like this. And I'm still a member of the community, and people still like me, and they're still my friend. And even the people who disagree with me will take me out to coffee and talk to me about it. So it's not some kind of like totalizing cult ideology that doesn't accept difference. And I mean, I guess I knew that, but it's still very heartening for me for that to have been the experience. Quick thing about like what the kids are taught. I guess the only thing I would say to that is my experience. So they are taught, the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo and the teachings and certainly the ideals of Auroville. My experience from being a kid and going to school in Auroville is that you should not spoon feed kids too much of this stuff, especially when you're young. Like if you think it's kind of weird, you think it's kind of boring, you're not open to it. And if you're spoon fed it too much, actually you recoil against it and you turn against it. And so I think the schools do a pretty good balance of not overdoing it. And I certainly know, like in the case of my kids, I want them to just discover it on their own when they're open to it. Some people have spiritual openings when they're very young, but I think most people it sort of happens later in life. It happens when you're a little bit older. And I think, it's sort of in the air they breathe, but let them discover it more specifically when they're older.
And in terms of spiritual practice with the adults, obviously you have here, the meditation part of it. Is that practice that most people engage in regularly, or are there like study groups, or how does that play out in the community?
Well, it's not ritualized. The closest you would have to a kind of ritual would be these bonfires that happen at the Marymount on special occasions. So they have these big bonfires and people just get around and meditate. But it's pretty private. The practice is very private. Like to the extent I have a practice, it's very private. It consists of meditation. And in fact, I describe a meditation scene in the book where I'm meditating. And even my wife said, that's the first time I've never described your meditations before. And I think that's probably true for many organizations, that it's people who live there mostly have a sense of being there for a purpose and having some kind of receptivity and openness to this, but it's not like a kind of very public ritualized thing.
Sri Aurobindo actually too had a very specific idea about education. Is that alive in the school?
Yeah, I mean, education is a complicated topic in Auroville because, as you see in the book, one of the darkest chapters in Auroville's history involved, when the schools were closed down in the name of some of these philosophies and rejecting the old world. And I don't think that was actually came from the mother and Sri Aurobindo. I think that was a kind of bastardization or corruption of what they taught, because like in the ashram, when the mother was alive, there were very good schools and education was a big part of it. So I think that was more this kind of really like a 60s rebellion kind of thing. Out with the old world, throw out the old, we must reinvent the new, and book knowledge is pointless. And it was a very dark chapter in the community's history. I described a book burning scene, and so I think the ghosts of that still hang over the community.
And the last thing around the governance, I can ask one more. It's just that Chris and I spent time in our early years in Quaker communities, which decisions are made by consensus. And I don't think it's any surprise that Quaker communities are small.
Mhm.
Like I never grew.
Yeah.
Because it gets unmanageable, right, at a certain point. But I know, friends of, maybe she's showing around, talked about that being an issue and a project. I just wonder where you're at as a community. Like, is there an agreement that we need to have some kind of decision around how this is going to look, or competing visions of that?
I think that, like somebody referenced that New York Times article, I think there's a strong sense of, right now, I think there's a strong sense of crisis in the community. And that sort of, and this has happened relatively fast, like over the last few months. It's probably been bubbling for a while, but there's a sense that the current institutional systems are not really capable of dealing with what they need to be dealing with. And so I don't think there's a solution on the table right now, but if you believe you want to be positive, I think that seeing the crisis and facing up to it might be the first step. Acknowledging it might be the first step to finding a solution. So hopefully that's good.
I think that's it for today. Thank you very much.